Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to see you all here in the audience. I want to welcome you all to the Mandel School on behalf of Dean Cleve Gilmore and the faculty of the Masters of Nonprofit Organizations degree, which I currently chair. My name is Rob Fisher. I'm an associate professor here at the school, and I will be your MC, moderator, and yes, your advocate for the evening. So I'm really excited about this program, and I'm so pleased that, you know, if we had one of these folks for tonight, I would have felt really good. The fact that, you know, all the dials clicked and we got all three, we are really in for a treat tonight on this topic of nonprofit advocacy. I would, before we get started, just call your attention to the flyers that show the other two events in this series. On March 21st, we have a session on strategic branding for nonprofits. And on April 25th, we are having a conversation with Steve Minter, the former exec of the Cleveland Foundation and now at Cleveland State University as an executive in residence. So I invite you to join us for those in the series as well. So why nonprofit advocacy? So if we go back to the Latin, ad, toward, vocare, to plead in favor of. And we link that to our work in the nonprofit sector, where we are continuously advocating for the interests of others, for the interests of our civic space, and even for our own staff in our organizations and for the workforce that serves in the sector. Here at the Mandel School, we educate people to be change agents, which is our tagline, through social work and nonprofit management. And change itself requires an advocate. Advocating for oneself, for one's client, represents an act of individual courage and determination. And tonight, we are shifting the lens from that individual focus of advocacy, which frankly many of us are comfortable with, to the question of how organizations can engage in advocacy, taking place at a different level, but still requiring the same attributes and strengths and courage that our organizations have within them. And I will say that, you know, nonprofits are uniquely positioned to perform this kind of role, as we're going to talk about tonight, as trusted, independent partners with civic missions to educate and inform residents, voters, taxpayers, and policymakers. So that gives us a special calling to participate in this work. As a researcher, I think about advocacy is kind of a lot like data sharing for nonprofits. Most organizations know that there could be tremendous value in doing it, but they believe that they are legally not able to, often erroneously. So the laws are certainly part of this conversation, and we will address those tonight. But it's also about getting some momentum in line with pursuing advocacy goals for organizations. So with that preamble, I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight, starting from my immediate left, John Corlett. And you have bio sheets, but I'll just tell you that John is currently the Executive Director and President of the Center for Community Solutions, which is a tremendous resource and advocate itself in our region. He was formerly with the Metro Health System. He was our state's Medicaid Director for several years. And he has a tremendous career of working in advocacy at various levels. Secondly, Marcia Egbert is with the George Gund Foundation. She's the Senior Program Officer for Human Services. She's been there quite a while. And before that, she was with the National Urban Policy Institute. She was worked with Cuyahoga County Commissioners and with the Speaker of the Ohio House. And then lastly, Alicia Washington is the Vice President of Government Advocacy at the Greater Cleveland Partnership. She's been with Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, the Centers for Families and Children, also in government relations roles, and I am required by policy and law to acknowledge that she is an alumna of our my Masters of Nonprofit Organizations degree. So the way we're going to do this is I've asked each of them to give us 15 minutes of their thoughts and reflections on this topic and some guidance. And just loosely, Marcia is going to start us off, and we tried to divide up levels of government. So Marcia's taking including more comments related to local, regional. John's going to address more state level, and Alicia's going to comment on federal level advocacy, along with other perspectives that they want to share. So we're going to go Marcia, John, Alicia, and then following that, I'll have a few warm-up questions for them, softball questions, if you will, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And we will have a traveling mic, so we can make sure that we are sharing both the questions and the answers with our live stream audience that's with us tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcia, and I'm going to sit down. So can we welcome our panel?
Well, thank you. This crowd is amazing, and thank you, Rob, so much, and to MSAS, both community treasures, for such a wonderful invitation. And I couldn't be more thrilled than to be joining my colleagues on my right and my left, two of the brilliant advocates that this community puts out into the world. So thank you so much. So I don't have much of a voice, so can you hear me in the back okay? Great. Wonderful. Okay, well, I wanted to start by just sharing something really quickly. So one of my heroes is the great 20th century peace activist, the Reverend William Sloane Coffin. And among the many, I think, profound and inspiring things that he has said was this, that charity is a matter of personal attribute, but justice is a matter of public policy, and never can the first be a substitute for the second. And I think that that's probably what we're here to talk about tonight. So direct service, that's charity in the very best sense of the word, I would say. But engaging in advocacy, engaging in social change efforts, that's justice, and where we'll focus our conversation. So before I dive in, I just want to take a moment to identify what advocacy is. The simplest, most direct definition I know is that advocacy is embracing and promoting a position and a point of view on an issue. Pretty straightforward. So, audience participation. Raise your hand, please, if you have an opinion. Any opinion on a social issue of the day, immigration, voting rights. Come on. I know you do. Great. So it's universal, right? We all have opinions on important issues of the day. So you've embraced a position, you've got a point of view, now you just need to add promoting it, and you're well on the way to being a great advocate. So moving on from that to the heart of today's conversation, why should nonprofits advocate? So as Rob said, we all tend to do that in some way, shape, or form in our own personal or professional capacities. But what does it mean, and why should a nonprofit organization embrace advocacy as a core part of its mission? So why should overworked, underpaid, too few hours in the day staff of nonprofits engage in the messy, sometimes controversial, always shifting sands of the public policy landscape? And even more to the point, how does advocacy fit in to an already demanding nonprofit organization's mission? So we'll talk about that. I want to share 4 quick reasons to make the case for this, even though there's a lot more that we could talk about. So first, I'd argue that there's a responsibility embedded in any nonprofit's mission to leave no stone unturned in pursuing its goals. So no nonprofit's an island, right? Every nonprofit works within a statutory and a regulatory framework, and every organization and every organization's clients have been impacted by government decisions. So for nonprofits to sit on the sidelines while the policy environment in which they operate is formulated by others, we believe does a disservice to your clients. So pick your metaphor, whether you're leaving a tool in the box or you're leaving the playing field to others. In an era, I would argue, of growing inequality and need, that just shouldn't be an option. So too often we think that nonprofits are suited up and ready to get in the game, meaning they've got all of the tools needed to actually secure policy wins for their constituents in terms of experience, expertise, people power, but they don't necessarily put them to use. And we believe advocacy is really an essential and a very positive strategy for helping a nonprofit fully live into its mission, fully achieve its mission. So second, I believe that funding social change efforts and direct services are actually the flip sides of the same coin. So direct service helps meet immediate need. Advocacy helps leverage lasting change. We shouldn't ignore, the pressing needs in our own backyard. So the homeless need a roof tonight, families need health care, the hungry need meals. So nonprofits are doing that essential daily work of running shelters and health clinics and food banks. But at the same time, I'd argue that nonprofits can't make a lasting impact on issues like homelessness or illness or hunger without affecting the policy environment that controls all the resources nonprofits have to fight their battles. So we see direct service and advocacy as going hand in hand. Consider this example. I'll give you one from our own shop. So for years, the George Gund Foundation has supported Cleveland area low-income housing programs with grants really to the tune of almost $1 million a year. So substantial investment in local low-income housing programs. But over the last decade plus, we simultaneously invested in a campaign directed by the statewide Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, COHIO, to create what's known as the Ohio Housing Trust Fund. And that trust fund is now up to over $50 million a year, over $10 million of which comes back directly to support low-income housing needs in Greater Cleveland, a number that we could never get to through grant making, but really shows that the direct service and the advocacy work go hand in hand. So third, I'd say that advocacy fits squarely inside a nonprofit's mission because it really gives voice to the voiceless. When you think about it, nonprofits are in the position of being able to be surrogates for the clients or the constituents that they serve and who are too often, if not routinely, excluded from public policy debates. So when nonprofits engage in such work, you bring the views represented by tens of thousands of Clevelanders, hundreds of thousands of Ohioans, with little or no direct access to the halls of power. You bring them into the marketplace idea, you give them a seat at the table, you make policy debates more equitable, more just, and more inclusive. And that feels pretty powerful to me. So finally, I would say funding advocacy should be done because it can be done. So contrary to the belief of many in the nonprofit world, and I might add in philanthropy as well, funding efforts at promoting social change and, yes, even direct lobbying, which we'll talk more about, are not only perfectly legal, but they're actually encouraged through the provisions in the federal tax code and by our friends at the IRS. Of course, there's parameters. Every environment's got its rules, but they're really quite easily understood, and they're there to be embraced for the benefit of nonprofit organizations and ultimately your constituents. So, turning for a second, I'm going to just focus a couple minutes on this notion of how the IRS is our friend in this world. So this notion that, especially in this time of the year, this notion that the IRS genuinely encourages nonprofit advocacy is a good pivot point to understanding just a few of the most important rules governing that advocacy work. So I'm going to quickly hit three highlights, but really want to encourage you to seek what I know to be the most clear, concise, up-to-the-minute, accurate information and support by becoming familiar with the organization, the Alliance for Justice, and its Boulder Advocacy website. Some of you may know the Alliance, but if not, I'm here to tell you it is the single best go-to resource and one-stop shop for finding out the rules of the road and helping nonprofits engage effectively and legally, that's always good, and legally in nonprofit advocacy. So just go to www.boulderadvocacy.org and you will have hit upon a jackpot. Okay, so let's hit 3 highlights. First, in the eyes of the law, advocacy and lobbying are 2 very different things, and the IRS mostly cares about lobbying. So that, of course, makes us ask the question, what's lobbying? We've talked about what advocacy is. So if advocacy is embracing and promoting a position or a point of view, lobbying takes that notion even further. So lobbying, to be as short as possible about explaining this, is promoting that position that you have as an organization through direct communication to a legislator or legislative staff, asking to take specific action on a specific piece of legislation. So there's 4 elements to what lobbying is. So let's give an example. So you've got a letter that you want to send to Cleveland City Council President Kevin Kelly, and you work at a homeless shelter, and you want to say, Council President Kelly, based on what we see in our shelter every day in Cleveland, the city should be investing more in homeless prevention services, not lobbying, right? Different letter, same organization, to Council President Kelly. Based on what we see in our shelter in Cleveland every day, we urge you to vote yes on Ordinance 83-19 that creates a new homeless prevention service and allocates $2 million a year to implement it. That's lobbying. Hits those 4 elements. Second, so now we know that the IRS focuses in on lobbying and defines it for us. And it does so by declaring that there's actually 2 different kinds of lobbying. Direct, which I just talked about, and grassroots. And generally, as I mentioned, direct lobbying is what I just described. It's that direct communication made to a legislator or a legislative employee asking for specific action on specific legislation. And you've got that definition sort of locked into your head right now. But grassroots lobbying is a different type of communication, and it's an attempt to influence specific legislation, again, same first couple of bullets, but it's by encouraging the public, and not your organization's own members or constituents, but the general public, to contact legislators about a piece of legislation. It's got to refer to that specific legislation, reflect a view. We're going to go through the same kind of drill, but it's really targeted at asking the public to take a specific action rather than that direct communication with the legislator herself. Okay, so now we know the IRS says there's a big difference between advocacy and lobbying, and there's a difference between direct and grassroots lobbying. So what's next? And that brings us to the 3rd key rule. The IRS says to nonprofits it's perfectly legal to lobby, but you've got to choose one of 2 tests by which we're going to gauge your compliance with our federal rules. The oldest and best-known standard is something called the insubstantial part test, and that says that lobbying has to be an insubstantial part of a charity's activities, but they fail to define what insubstantial means. So pattern and practice over the decades has sort of come to be that around 5%, up to about 5% of the charity's expenditures could be considered insubstantial. Gives you some wiggle room, but not that much protection in the scheme of things. So the other standard is what I think of as the golden rule of nonprofit advocacy, and it doesn't have an interesting name. It's just really important. And it's called the Section 501H Expenditure Test. You did not know you'd be leaving here tonight being able to quote the IRS code, but you can, because you're going to know about the Section 501H Expenditure Test. And I have to admit, there are not many IRS codes that I would wax rhapsodic about, but this is one. 501H sets specific dollar limits on the amount nonprofits that elect this standard can spend to influence legislation without incurring penalty taxes, without jeopardizing your nonprofit tax status at all. And those limits are much more generous than the insubstantial part test. That was said in all caps. Those limits are much more substantial. So let me give you an example. The total lobbying expenditure limits under the 501H test start at 20% of the first 500,000 of qualifying expenditures under a nonprofit's budget. So already you see you've moved from maybe around 5% to up to at least 20% being fully flexible and supported through the IRS if you elect this 501H test. And I really wanted to bring a prop for you to reinforce the capital letter nature of this. And that is to say that, believe it or not, the 501H expenditure test is a one-page IRS form. This is it. This is it. In 10 minutes, you too can be on your way to having much greater flexibility and security in embedding advocacy as a core part of your mission. So remember IRS Form 5768, well, you don't have to remember that, but just go to Boulder Advocacy and print out the form, and it takes you 10 minutes. Since charities which exceed the insubstantial test, so don't elect this 501H test, risk penalties, and they do risk jeopardizing their tax status, our advice is just do the right thing, do the simple thing, choose the 501H test, fill out the form, save your mental health, save your board's mental health, and get out there and advocate knowing that the IRS has your back. So to conclude, you can see the IRS provides what it calls safe harbors that offer nonprofits lots of protection under the law for lobbying activity. Yet misconceptions abound in the nonprofit world, in the philanthropic world. And it's just so unfortunate that it has this effect of dampening progress on public policies that could be helping tens and thousands of our neighbors and friends and constituents and clients and citizens in the state. So really for us, it comes down to this one basic democratic principle. People and organizations who are affected by public policies ought to be involved in making them and making them work. So our message to nonprofits is put your toe in the water, dive into the advocacy pool. The water's warm, the harbor's safe, and your constituents and your community really, really need you. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcia, and good evening to everybody. My name is John Corlett, and I want to mention Alicia is actually one of my board members, so I've got like a supervisor here, and I also
She used to work at the Gun Foundation.
yeah, we're all connected. We're all connected,
Alicia's world.
right? And then I also want to acknowledge that my cousin is here, Dr. Claudia Colton, so the person who I looked up to when I was growing up, and so it's really wonderful to be here with her tonight too. So. So my charge was to talk a little bit about the state and kind of what's sort of transpiring there now, and so I'll do a little bit of that. I also want to talk a little bit about the Center for Community Solutions where I work now. We've been around for 106 years, so we're a rather old organization, but we are really committed to advocacy. That's a big part of our mission, and we've taken the 501H election. We did that years ago, and so definitely recommend that. But I also want to say, if you're doing advocacy work, particularly if you're here in Cleveland and you either want to do local advocacy work or state or federal, we have a lot of information on our website. So we have profiles for every legislative district, for every state legislative district, for every congressional district, for every Cleveland neighborhood, for every Cleveland ward, for every county council district, every congressional district. We cut it, dice it, slice it, every which way. And so that's really good when you're going in to see somebody and you want to show that person why they should care about these things. One of the things I always tell people is that every district, no matter which way you look at it, whether they're wealthy or not, they all have people who qualify for assistance from a food bank. like Anthony Gonzalez, new member of Congress, 1 out of 5 of his constituents has incomes low enough to qualify to get services for a food bank. So we all have something at stake in these issues. And sometimes we get sort of separated out and think, well, that's just over there or just over there. And it really affects everybody. And I think makes advocacy really important. So we're kind of in this sort of interesting stage in Ohio in terms of politics because we're at a reset moment. A new governor represents a reset, and this one seems a little more dramatic in some ways because I was talking to someone today. I said, this last year was just so weird. In Columbus, we had a governor who probably spent more time on CNN than he did in Columbus, and who opined on everything. I mean, whether it was the Korea or international trade or Donald Trump, he had an opinion about everything. And as a result, he was, I think, really disconnected from kind of what was happening over the last year in Ohio, and certainly disconnected from the legislature. I mean, even among his own party, he is probably less popular than he was on the opposite party. But so we have a new governor and a new time, and we're only 22 days away from when he has to introduce his budget. By the state constitution, it has to be introduced on March 15th. He can introduce it sooner, but we are very close to that moment. And I think there are some really interesting opportunities that have not existed for some time. And I think the primary sort of group of opportunities is really around issues affecting children. It has been, I've been trying to think back, when was the last time that we had a governor that was really focused on these issues around kids? And in my mind, I'd be interested to see what Marcia or Alicia think. In my mind, it was really George Voinovich, the mayor of Cleveland and governor and U.S. senator, who really sort of initiated a lot of the sort of structural things around kids and around children's services and family children first councils and things like that. Yeah, so Mike DeWine was his lieutenant governor, and so in fact when he had his sort of campaign platform, I was like, oh my God, it's like deja vu all over again. It's some of the same kind of themes about really focusing on young kids, where we think we can make some of the where our investments can have some of the largest payoffs. But I think there's a bunch of things that are going to be sort of popping up, in the space around kids that I think will be interesting to watch and worth paying attention to. One is certainly around early care and education. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about increasing state investment there, increasing the eligibility levels for subsidized child care and things like that. That helps us with some of the issues that we talk about, like around the benefit cliff. When people's income goes up just a little bit, they tend to lose everything, and it makes it harder to make those transitions, up the economic ladder. I think around kids' behavioral health, I think that's also an area. The state, over the last several years through the state Medicaid agency, has done a lot around behavioral health, really sort of redesigned, that's the phrase they used, sort of redesigned like who could provide services, who could get paid for services, how much you could get paid, what the services would be. And I felt like from that conversation that kids were kind of largely absent from that. It was very adult focused and not particularly focused on children. And so I think there's going to be a renewed focus on how that system works with kids. And one of the issues that we focused a lot on is around what we call multi-system youth, children who are engaged in lots of different systems. They might be in the juvenile court system. They might be getting services through their school. They might be getting services through the developmental disability system. But with not a lot of coordination and not a lot of help for some of the and kids that have really severe problems, really, really deep concerns. And so I think, there's some effort to sort of there was a legislative committee that we worked with, a joint legislative committee that put out a lot of recommendations, bipartisan, unanimous recommendations that the last administration, frankly, did nothing with. And so some of those have already started to be acted on, and so we feel good about that. I think they've already invested more money in just the last couple of months than was probably invested in the last 8 years in some of this. And so we're optimistic that we're going to see more in that area. I think the other area that we're interested in is the whole area around infant mortality. I mean, everybody knows our numbers are so high in the state, and among African Americans, they're even worse. I mean, we have such disparities in terms of outcomes. And so almost every one of those kids largely who dies, who doesn't get past that first, is all on Medicaid. I mean, they're served by the public system, so it's really a failure of our system to sort of adequately care for these kids and invest in the kind of services. So I think what we have to figure out is how do we make that Medicaid program be more responsive to those mothers and those babies so that we don't have such shameful rates of infant mortality in the state and such disparity in the way that those rates play out. And I think there's an appetite for that, and I think there is some interest in that. I think, and I think that also applies to the issue around lead and lead poisoning in Cleveland. I think there's, the DeWine administration has said, we want to be on that issue. We want to work on that issue. We want to be helpful on that issue. And so we need to sort of, through our advocacy, keep them on that and keep them focused on that and see how we might do it. Now, I'm going to get sort of like nerdy, geeky, specific policy stuff to think about, because so in Ohio, our health system, our Medicaid system, and remember, Medicaid covers about 1 out of 3 people in Ohio. I mean, half of the kids, almost everybody who's in a skilled nursing facility, a nursing home, ends up on Medicaid at some point. So it's a really big program. And here in Cuyahoga County, it's even bigger. We have almost 600-some thousand people covered by the expansion, that was authorized by the Affordable Care Act. So it's a big program. So one of the things that they announced early on was that they were going to, and we deliver all that care through these private managed care companies, insurance companies. One is a nonprofit based here in Ohio, but the other 4 are for-profit insurance companies from out of state who basically manage the Medicaid program largely. So what they said they were going to do is they're going to reprocure those contracts. And what that means is they're going to say, these are the contracts we have today, but we want new contracts and we want new rules and new guidelines. And so it presents a real opportunity to we've got a lot of experience now. We know what works or doesn't work. And so we need to sort of update that procurement process, those contracts, so we get the kind of things back that we want. And I think where there is great opportunity in that space is really around the social determinants of health. Because, we just know that what really influences health at a large extent is what happens out here in the community and stuff, not what happens in a hospital. Having worked at a hospital, we always said that, 80% of your health happens outside of the hospital. 20% happens here with our doctors and healthcare facilities. So we've got a chance to sort of rework some of these things, and we've got to do it within all the federal rules and guidelines and stuff like that. But it feels like there's opportunity there, and also around the equity issue to really sort of to dig into that too and see how we can address that through procurement and the contracts and stuff. So the other thing I want to talk about is so that I think there's opportunity there, and it it's not like I don't know that I ever will agree with 100% of whatever they do. Like if I had to sort of touch on one area I'm concerned about, I expect any day that the federal government is going to approve Ohio's work requirement waiver for the expansion group in Medicaid. That's just going to happen any day. They've been checking down the list, and I think we're next, on the list in terms of states who've submitted that. And and so I guess our position about that now, so if it does get approved, here's the things I want to see. I want to make sure first, one of the things that was identified in the waiver was that this waiver was going to cost counties millions of dollars to implement it, but there has been no funding allocated to do that. So if you're not going to pay for it, you shouldn't be able to do it. You can't just put that sort of burden on local government to pay for and manage that process, because that's who would be charged with doing it. I think the other thing is, I think our eligibility system is really troubled. I serve on the board of the Cleveland Food Bank, and we had clients trying to get their SNAP benefits on the phone for 1 hour, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. They come into the office and they just put them on hold because, frankly, they can't afford all those minutes on their phone sitting there waiting, and then you get hung up on at 4:30, because people have to go home. So I want to make sure that the eligibility system will support what they say they want to do in the waiver. Third, there has to be a strong evaluation component in this. We want to know what happens to the folks who lose coverage and what happens to the folks. We want to know if this is supposed to get people working, how many people get jobs? What are their earnings? Are they actually doing that? We think it's important to have that sort of that track record involved in that. So there's things that we're not going to agree with on, and there's things that we will agree with on. But I also think that speaks to a point of, I was at the City Club a couple of weeks ago, and I was sort of going through all my thing, and I said, but in the end, on the politics stuff, I'm still a gay, feminist, pro-choice, liberal, Democrat, or whatever. But I'll work with anybody. Like I'm all there, and so and if it's working with folks who disagree with me politically, that's fine. Because I don't know that anybody would have predicted that Governor Kasich would have become such a strong champion for Medicaid expansion. This expansion would not have happened in this state without his leadership on it. And I don't know that I would have predicted that, when he ran for election the first time. I don't think I would. And so we just have to be careful that we don't just sort of put these labels on people and just think, well, we can't talk to them. They're never going to talk to us. And I also mentioned that, speaking of the only two thank you letters I got from legislators, both came from Republicans when I stepped down as Medicaid director. And so just remember that you've got to involve everybody in this, and that the other thing about a lot of this work is we're on somebody's side today, but maybe not tomorrow. There's another issue that comes up tomorrow, and so you want to make sure you maintain those relationships as you do this advocacy work. And we really pride ourselves on being nonpartisan, that we're not in this to do gotcha stuff. Gotcha stuff is kind of fun sometimes. You get that great headline in the paper, it looks great, you feel good, but the people who make the policy are still there, and they usually don't appreciate that very much. And so when you go to see them, it's hard to get a meeting sometimes with them. So you want to make sure that what you do is about building relationships for the long term. Because as Marcia mentioned, Ohio with the Housing Trust Fund, that took 15 years, 10 years?
8 to get the budget.
Yeah, 8 years to get that funding. But I mean, if they hadn't, when they didn't get it the first year, if they had just gone blazing guns, said, you're horrible, you're immoral, people are going to die because you didn't, they might not have got there then. They might not have been able to pick people up. So I think a lot of this work is really long-term work. It takes a long time, but I think the payoffs are really important. And I guess the last thing I would say is, if your organization is thinking about this, you work in an organization where you might thinking about getting this advocacy space, it can take a little bit of time. People need to get comfortable with it. I mentioned before I'm on the board of the food bank. I remember when we first decided to get into advocacy, and people were really nervous about it. Like, I don't know what they thought we were going to do, but they didn't think it was going to be good. And so I'm still on the board. 10 years later or whatever. And what was so interesting and what was so inspiring about the journey we went on and how we got people comfortable with it and committed to doing advocacy and engaging in it was, when there was the effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act. The food bank sent out an email to all of its donors and supporters and said, oppose ACA repeal. We would not have done that when we first started. We would have been too afraid to do that. We wouldn't have had the experience to do that. But we kind of worked into it, and we probably got some complaints from people. I'm sure we did, but we were kind of ready for it, and people were comfortable with it, and we saw that because we knew healthcare, people when they're uninsured end up in our food bank lines. That's why they end up there, because they're high healthcare costs, and so if we take that away, we're just producing more business for the food bank in terms of that. So, anyways, lots to do, and. One more thing. So the other thing not to forget in advocacy is it just doesn't all happen on the legislative side. It also happens in state agencies. They're the ones, somebody told me when I was Medicaid director that I was sort of like the students and they were the townies, in terms of a college or whatever, that they were going to be there long after I was in and out, and some of them still are there actually. So a lot happens in those state organizations, a lot of really good stuff, a lot of really smart people. And so you also want to develop the relationships there. So, Alicia.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is, yes. Thank you, job well done. So again, my name is Alicia Washington. I am the Vice President of Government Advocacy for Greater Cleveland Partnership, which is the Regional Chamber of Commerce for Northeast Ohio. Our work is really focused around creating the conditions for economic growth and job creation in Northeast Ohio, and I've been with the Chamber for about 5 years. We work with about 11,000 companies across the region, small, mid-market, large, around our priorities from a strategy perspective, but then also from a public policy perspective. But But before I started in the kind of business chamber world, I was in Health and Human Services. So I led government affairs for the Center for Families and Children, as Rob mentioned. I think you did at one point as well. My first introduction into advocacy was actually as a fellow at the George Gunn Foundation and taking trips down 71 with Marcia, working on some things with the administration at that time. And I've even led government affairs within the community development world to really help our CDCs in the city of Cleveland think through how they collectively work together to advocate. I've participated in statewide coalitions. I currently lead a federal level coalition of chambers of commerce across the Great Lakes region. So I've been in this work for quite a while from a kind of practitioner perspective, a little over 10 years now. So my hope is to kind of build on the things that you've heard from Marcia and John around, you've made your election, you've gotten your organization comfortable with advocacy. How do you think about the strategy that actually goes into doing the work, right? But before I do that, the thing that I pulled the short straw on was talking about the federal landscape, which is interesting to say the least. So I'll give you a sense of, at least from where I sit in the world, what I see playing out and what I think is important to pay attention to. So clearly, we all just witnessed this past midterm elections, the quote unquote blue wave that came across the country. Some places saw it more strongly than others, but it led to a change of control in the U.S. House, with now Democrats taking that top seat. But we still have a Republican-controlled Senate and White House, and quite frankly, as we've all seen play out either through Twitter and headlines, a very unpredictable president, which does make, for a change of focus for Congress and federal agencies any given week, right? So these are up and down dynamics that we continue to see play itself out. And even though we've just gotten through an election cycle, we're already preparing for what 2020 is going to look like. But despite a lot of just kind of the politics of this playing itself out, policy work is actually still getting done, right? So we just got through a partial federal shutdown and got through a deal to finalize FY or fiscal year 2019 appropriations. And now our attention starts to turn to what's going to happen for fiscal year 2020. But we also saw the passage of a major tax reform law, right? That we're all still figuring out what it means in many aspects, but that happened. And I think from a kind of community development perspective within that was the creation of opportunity zones, right? This program that now will look at increased incentives for development in underserved areas across the nation. What does that mean for a place like Cleveland, right? So this has passed, and we're now trying to figure out what that means. We also saw the passage of the Perkins Act, right? So we have a new Perkins Act that looks at career technical education across the country. And Cleveland, through CMSD, our Cleveland Metropolitan School District, we have our career academies that are thinking about how do we introduce students early on to different career paths. That all trickles down from what happens with Perkins. So like that passed, and that is being implemented, past the regulatory process, and really states really thinking about how to use those funds for work they're going to do on the ground. And we also saw the passage of criminal justice reform legislation, right? So again, they're still unpacking it, still understanding what a lot of that means. But even in the midst of a lot of chaos, Congress is still working and things are still happening. So I think it's easy to get lost in the headlines and miss that point, but we can't miss that point if we're going to be true advocates in this work. And I can assure you, for the folks that I talk to and spend time with, especially with the next appropriations process heating up, folks are already starting to line up to think through what are our policy agendas, what are our priorities going to look like, what coalitions do we need to build for the work that we're going to do, and what meetings with members do we need to start thinking about to ensure that they understand, our advocacy points and then those specific bills that we want to lobby on. And as we think about that overall environment, again, there are several things playing out here, right? So the president will likely introduce his budget or some form of it by the middle of March. And I think then Congress, they're already doing some work now, but then it's really off to the races, because that will be their blueprint for how they think about funding levels for a variety of programs, everything from water infrastructure to what I think will be a leading issue, particularly for the House, around public transportation and infrastructure, right? So how are we thinking about funding for public transit? How are we thinking about funding for roads and bridges? Are we completely still hands off from thinking about an increase in a federal gas tax? Probably, but the debate will probably just play itself out to a degree anyway. But even with all of that, I think outside of even the appropriations process, we'll continue to see some level of this debate around healthcare reform. A number of things that John has kind of talked about, right? Like whether it's on a moral ideology standpoint or looking at tweaks to the ACA or anything within that regard, I think we'll see that continue to play itself out. But I think a key piece of this, and I actually was having a conversation with the chief of staff for a federal elected leader before coming here, is that there's the Budget Control Act, right, which we put in place several years back to try to put caps on spending for non-defense and defense programs where we've hit that cap. So now Congress has to figure out, do we reduce spending? Do we raise the caps? And all this factors into a conversation of how you think about a new budget. And, oh, by the way, also throw in what happens in our economy. Will we see another downturn that impacts some of this in the next several years or not, right? So in all of this kind of messiness that is evolving, it has a direct impact then on what happens at the state and local level. I have found through all the different sectors and level of organizations, from a health and human services nonprofit to working in a chamber, that there are some tried and true strategies that, regardless of how you come to this work, are effective. And I will say that I am a very non-traditional lobbyist. I did not come at this work through the typical path that I've seen through some of my peers of I've worked for an elected leader, I've spent time in Columbus and spent time in D.C. and leveraged that experience in those relationships to then flip out and become a registered lobbyist. I started as a fundraiser. I worked at Severance Hall while I was a student here working on my master's in nonprofit organizations, and then got the Gun Fellowship, and Marsha was one of the first people that helped me kind of start to see the power in advocacy as a part of my work within the nonprofit sector. So what I learned as a fundraiser, and for any of you that are fundraisers in this room, you can relate to it, it's all about the power of relationships. It is getting to know people, understanding their priorities, understanding what drives them, and finding the sweet spot in that allows you to get things done, right? So some of John's kind of last comments around working with people that are different from you, have different ideologies from you, I mean, that's just a given in this work, right? I do it every single day, whether I'm at City Hall or at the State House or on the Hill. But relationship building is the bread and butter of what you do as an advocate, because people have to know you, they have to trust you to an extent, they have to believe in what you're saying in order to work with you on an issue. And all relationships are going to be important to what that looks like. And so that leads to kind of my second point, which is around understanding member priorities, right? What are the issues that they say are top of mind and important for them? What are the bills that they're introducing that they're working on? How does that line up with the public policy agenda that you have for your organization? Because where there's overlap, that's your sweet spot. That's where you're most likely to get things done, right? I've worked with members from different areas of the state, and they have probably had priority areas that had nothing to do with anything that I was working on at that point in time, but then they had a particular interest maybe around an early childhood issue. And in there, we found an area to work together on. And it might be the only area we work together on in the time that we're both kind of around, but we found alignment. We found that sweet spot. So that's important. The third piece building off of that is the compelling message, right? So, I mean, when you look at, beyond the legal definition of lobbying, kind of the social context around it is we literally are in lobbies, in hallways, right? So you may have the length of time from this end of the room to the other to talk to someone about why an issue is important to you. So that means you have to be powerful, succinct, and very clear about what it is that you're asking for. I've made advocacy pitches from an elevator ride from the bottom floor up to the third floor, right? Like, you have to get good at being able to communicate quickly on what you need or what you want that legislative leader or their staff to do, because that may be the best time that you have before you can do a follow-up with them. The fourth point I would make around that is really consider your messenger as well, right? And this is understanding, and in a world of being a lobbyist where egos abound, there's also a reality that you can't have too much of an ego in this work, surprisingly, right? Because you may not always be the best messenger to push an issue. There might be an instance to where the chairman of the finance committee is from the Dayton area and really only has a strong interest in meeting with organizations and companies from his area. So me as a representing an organization in Cleveland, I don't have a lot of sway there. But if I have a partner or someone that I'm working with on this issue that is from the Dayton area, they're more likely to be able to either make the advocacy pitch or at least get the meeting and kind of tee it up so then I can kind of carry it home. So you have to be thoughtful about that. And the best way to do that is through fifth point, coalition building, right? I think this is a sweet spot for this work, and particularly for the nonprofit sector. And it goes back to some of the earlier comments that Marsha made, to where our strength in this sector is really the people that we represent and helping them get a seat at the table. And where you don't have money, you have votes, right? And you think about that piece of it, to where the coalitions I've worked with have been broad and diverse, and that's really effective in this work, to where, and again, I've done some of this with Marsha and just past work with the Gun Foundation, to where Pre-for-Clee, I mean, that has business, that has local government, that has funders, that has workforce organizations. You have a nice mix of organizations all rallying together because they believe in the importance of quality early childhood education. I lead a coalition of chambers across the Great Lakes region, which gives much more strength to the work that I do in Congress, when it's not just, GCP or Greater Cleveland Partnership showing up on an issue, but it's Cleveland, it's Detroit, it's New York, it's Pittsburgh. I now have a much broader group of businesses that are thinking about an issue, and that means much more to congressional folks or even at the state level than when it's just you on your own, right? So those coalitions and coming together on that work is important. And the last point I'll make, which builds off of what John talked about, is that this work takes time. You need a lot of patience to really be engaged in advocacy and lobbying this way. I mean, the Housing Trust Fund was a perfect example, right? It took over 10 years to get that work done, right? To move from an idea, an advocacy pitch, a piece of legislation that had to ebb and flow and move over time before you could have it happen. I've had the same thing happen to me on an issue that I think encapsulates all of this a bit. And I think Natoya Walker-Minor was in the room from the city of Cleveland, and she was a partner on this, but local hiring, right? So several years back, the state wanted to challenge local government's ability to require that for major construction projects, a certain percentage of local residents had to be hired onto that project. It took work through the chamber to where we were the only chamber in the state to disagree with the state on that. And we had to join with other partners in the city of Cleveland to demonstrate why that was important. It was because we signed on to a community benefits agreement. It was very much an inclusive workforce issue for us. So we challenged the state on that point. But this was several years of work that took time, from a bill popping up and then dying, and then an amendment getting stuck into another bill, us being able to pull it out, and then another amendment pops up, and then you fight it that way. So you're always having to be watching what's happening in the legislative process, because these things just ebb and flow and play themselves out over time. But even in those conversations, again, back to relationships, back to the messenger, while we ultimately lost that battle on the legislative front in terms of killing the ultimate bill that did pass, what I found interesting in my conversations with members at the state level was that folks just assume, oh, you're a business group, you're going to be with us on this so we can move forward. And it's like, well, actually, no, we're not. And here are the reasons why. And while, again, the bill passed, we changed the number of votes from members in our area that were planning to vote for the bill, but then ultimately moved against doing that because of the messenger that showed up, right? They never expected a business group to take that perspective, and it changed their thinking on it because also of the relationship that I had with these members to make a strong and compelling case on why that was important. So again, the work takes time, but I think, the use of kind of those 6 strategies, and I think we've all touched on them a bit, you just kind of keep churning that, because that's all a part of this work and your ability to be successful in it. So thank you.
My head is swimming a little bit. I don't know about yours. So I wanted to ask a few questions, take a prerogative here, and go back to the kind of the nonprofit organization thinking about making some advances in its advocacy work. I think in many of our organizations, our staff might have what we would call micro advocacy skills, and they have confidence in their ability to do those things on behalf of clients, on behalf of the issues where they're working at the street level. at what point can we get by with using our current staff who have certain innate abilities? At what point do we need to transition to not professional advocates, but people who are can we train up our current staff to do this job? Or at what point do we need to think about shifting and investing more directly in people who are trained to do this kind of work? Because frankly, when you all, John and Alicia, when you all started talking about certain, bills and pockets, you lost me. And
It's his own special language.
yeah, you gotta have the capacity and appetite for this sort of thing. So I don't know if somebody would like to give some thoughts on that issue. Is this I heard Marcia saying all organizations can do more, but is there some tipping point where the board says, yes, we're going to do this wholeheartedly, and now we need to hire, new staff to lead this effort?
I mean, that would be ideal if you have those kind of resources, but I think most people probably don't. I mean, I think it's okay to kind of ease your way into this. I don't think you have to sort of jump in full force or dive into the pool. I think you can figure out what the issue that's important. I mean, I think the value, Rob, that people who are involved in direct service bring, they actually bring knowledge about how things actually work. Like, the policy can sometimes be up here, but then you talk to someone who delivers services or is a caseworker or whatever, you're like, oh, that's how it really works. We thought it worked this way, and so I think that's a really valuable perspective to be able to bring to a lot of these policy conversations, is how things actually work in practice. So I think that's helpful. There's lots of training that's available. We do training, other folks do training, advocacy, and it can be really basic. I mean, you can make it really simple. And I just think getting into it, and I think, a really simple thing to do, at least I think it's simple, would be just to organize a committee of your board, a policy committee for your board, if you have a volunteer board. Because there's usually a lot of people who are kind of interested a little bit in this, who are interested in policy or pay attention to politics or, that kind of stuff. And it's also a way to engage donors. Sometimes donors tend to have a lot of interest in this as well. So you may have people that aren't involved with you as board members, but maybe volunteers or donors that might be interested. But I think you can start really small and pick something to work on, and you can sort of and there's ways that you can kind of evaluate whether you think you're making progress and stuff like that. I don't know.
So I would jump in on that, right, because I've lived this experience to where I think if you're just starting out and it's an organization that may not feel like it has the resources, I have found from my own lived experience that leveraging coalitions or statewide organizations is an easy way to transition into that work. It doesn't require much of you other than signing up for an email list, maybe attending a few meetings or jumping on some conference calls, but there is a organization or association that has paid staff that does this on your behalf. And if it costs you a membership, it's probably nominal, especially in the health and human services world, right? They organize lobby days or Hill visits that make it easy for you to take part in kind of the advocacy and lobbying process, but it puts the onus on someone else to prep you for what that looks like. So I think that's an easy kind of entry point when your organization may not have the capacity. I think if you are tipping towards the capacity, the biggest mistake I've seen, and I've suffered from this even in some of my earliest jobs, is that I personally have the belief that you have to really be committed to all or nothing, right? So I've seen a number of job positions and postings, and I've been in some of those jobs where it is, we want you to do advocacy, but we also want you to do fundraising, and then we also want you to do marketing, and then throw 2 other things on there at the end. We know how hard that is, and just a job in general when you have so many responsibilities on you. It is nearly impossible to think about trying to be a strong advocate for an organization when you have so many other things pulling at you. So my advice and what I've done when I've worked with organizations that have been interested in this is that, if you're going to commit the resources, truly commit the resources to do it. Whether you promote someone internal to look at that role or hire from the outside, you can think about entry-level roles. That's how I got into the work. I came into an organization to do government affairs at an entry-level position. There was a committee of the board that was looking at advocacy work so I could leverage them. And those are great as well, because most times if you have board members that have some level of financial means or status, office, they become extensions for you, right? So we couldn't afford to go to political fundraisers within our organization in terms of out of our own pockets. Our board members could take us as guests when they decided to go, right? Because they paid out of their pocket, and then that gave me or my CEO access to a member they needed to see. But we didn't have to expend resources to do that out of our own pockets because we didn't have it, right? Or the advice that they bring. I mean, some of my earliest mentors in this work were board members for the organization I work for that took me with them to Columbus and introduced me to the people that they worked with. That does dividends for you if you're in a nonprofit organization that doesn't have the capacity, but you're leveraging the relationships of your organization to do it.
In just a minute. I have another follow-on question, and that is about, I'll say ethics, but what I really mean is, for many nonprofits, almost a squeamishness about seeming self-interested. So by advocating for more investment in the work we do, that we are promoting ourselves, and that maybe that's just part and parcel of the kind of people that work in the sector. But I think the extension of that is in most systems, there are the organizations that maybe wholly do direct service and those that maybe are intervention type service and those that do prevention. So in that example, if you think about advocacy generally for resources, maybe we can grow the pie for everyone. But sometimes the advocacy has to come at the expense of partners and peers because it might be seen as a zero-sum game. So if we're going to give more to early intervention services, we're going to have to take it from services for older children. And and that I know what Marcia, and that may be a false perception, but the advocacy, I know it's a continuous running game, but sometimes it almost feels like you are stealing from Peter to pay Paul in some of these. And if I'm wrong, dissuade me of that, but help me with that thought.
You're wrong.
Excellent.
There's so much to say about that, which I know my colleagues could as well. But I mean, let me just start by saying that it is not the advocate's job to make a policymaker's decision-making responsibility easy for them. I mean, they have chosen to go into this line of work. They've put themselves before voters to say, I want to be in a position of making tough decisions. Well, fine. You're in the business of handing them some, in the sense that it is not a zero-sum game if you exist in a world where you don't always live with the size of the pie as it currently exists. So one of the things that we invest most in terms of advocacy at the Gund Foundation is how to make the pie grow, how to make the pie more equitable. And that, in the world of policy and advocacy, is investing in, now this is really, there's no way for me to make this sound incredibly interesting, tax and fiscal policy. It's like scary to say at this time of night, but it's really unbelievably important because that's where the size of the pie gets determined. And so you can't care, I would argue, about how much the state legislature invests in emergency hunger relief that benefits the food bank system if you don't also care about the fact that we've enacted a set of tax policies in Ohio that have withdrawn billions of dollars in potential revenue that could help, among other things, support our state network of food banks. And to say John's an expert in this is an understatement. But it really is setting up a false choice. And our hearts bleed in this sector, right? And we are apologetic. And I just want to shake myself and everybody else to say, no, we're not advocating for ourselves. We're advocating on behalf of people who are never going to walk through the door that you just walked through. And so it is not only is it not selfish, it's the exact opposite of that. But you've got to be aware of and interested in making the choices, not about robbing Peter to pay Paul, but investing in what we know works on behalf of who needs it the most, and that will stretch always scarce public resources the furthest. So.
You have dissuaded me of
I
my.
doubt it.
All right. Well, I'm going to walk over to the podium, and I'm hoping that I can hand this mic off to Lauren. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to open it up now to questions from the audience. If you'd wait for the mic to come. I know there was a hand.
Yeah, there was a hand.
There was a hand. So we'll start here.
I'm Tracy Movero. I used to run lobby days and trainings in Washington, D.C. for a number of years, so I'm really happy to see this in Cleveland. So I have one question and comment. Question is, where do people have an opportunity in Cleveland to get the hands-on training, like the role-playing, the things that make you feel a lot less scared to sit down in front of people, and that makes a big difference. And the comment is just sort of back up what was being said about you don't have to know everything to do this work. And it's easy to start feeling that way, especially when you're looking at policy papers or whatever. So what Alicia said is so true. Lean on the organizations that do that work. The most important things that you bring is the experience, especially if you're service providers, and also that you represent voters. And while you don't say that directly in a meeting, it's understood that's your power. And as I always said for people in Washington who come in and get scared about all this, I may have the big stacks of reports, but you've got the power back home. So I'm wondering what in Cleveland, where the opportunities are to learn how to do this.
I mean, I think there are lots of, a number of organizations do that. I mean, Community Solutions, we do lobbying training. I know the Western Reserve Area Agency on Aging does training. Business Volunteers Unlimited has done lobbying training before. And, Marcia mentioned the Boulder Advocacy website through Alliance for Justice. They've got a ton of stuff on their website around advocacy, both around sort of how to do it, but then I also think the part that's really interesting that they do is the whole evaluation point of this. How do we know that what we're doing, how do we measure ourselves that we're making a difference and moving things in the right direction? So there are different resources out there, and there are a number of groups who kind of do this this kind of work. So.
Yeah, let me just tack on to that. So, it makes me think, John, we should start back up the boot camps. We used to run advocacy boot camps at the local and the state level to help folks get more comfortable with that, and that's certainly possible for us to do. But we invest so much in the Alliance for Justice because they not only provide the type of resources that John just mentioned electronically, but they come here. They will come to Cleveland. We've brought them to Cleveland to run day-long or half-day-long trainings. They will come and talk with your board. Download those free tools. There's 3. One to gauge how your capacity can be grown. One to gauge how is your advocacy working. And one, if you're involved in the world of community organizing, how do you fairly evaluate the unique world of community organizing relative to, say, direct service. And so they also run free webinars constantly, probably 200 a year. So we keep going back to the Alliance, but they are an extraordinary resource that is free and available to you, and I urge you to take a look and engage them. And the next time that we host them here, we'll be happy to do a community-wide invitation to share their knowledge and coaching.
All right. I think we have.
I'm Cynthia White. As you were discussing the distinction between advocacy and lobbying, I thought of a question. Can churches lobby?
Yeah, that is a great question. The answer is yes. And not only in churches, but there's also a lot of branches coming off churches, right? They sometimes the church is the hub, but they'll have a sort of a spoke organization. And the answer is yes, they can. But there are they do have more restrictions around them, and again, the Alliance is a good resource for that. And unless something's changed in the very recent past, which I don't know that it has, churches have not been eligible for the 501H election. They have had to fall under the insubstantial part test. I want to double check myself on that because that would be bad to be wrong, but that's certainly been true.
Is that the 5% thing?
Yeah, again, 5%-ish. Right. But then a lot of churches, to Alicia's point, have denominational or geographic associations. The Ohio Council of Churches, Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry, which is one of the most experienced advocacy voices in the faith-based community in Ohio, probably beyond. So there are other networks and ways that the faith-based voice has played a very important role in a lot of advocacy issues locally and at the state level as well.
Who has the mic? There we go.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Griffin. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a board member with a statewide org called Ohioans to Stop Executions, and we're working to end Ohio's death penalty. And we've struggled sometimes over the years with sustaining funding, especially around grant making. So I'm wondering what fundraising tips, advice you have for nonprofits, especially who lean more towards the advocacy side of the coin. And we are a C3 too.
Have you filed your election, your 501H election?
Definitely.
Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent.
So good you're promoting that. It's made it so much clearer.
If you could see the excitement on her face at that statement, your mind would be blown.
Hi.
I don't know. I mean, I think well, they're Allie.
Nope.
I think it's different in different parts of the state. Like I think, so this is just putting my Cleveland hat on. I think Cleveland donors and foundations and stuff are a lot farther ahead than the rest of the state in terms of funding advocacy. I mean, and maybe it's just the funders that we work with, but we find that that's the piece that they're most interested in, that what we do. I mean, they want to know. I mean, I think they kind of know what your plan is. Like, what's your what we might call your theory of change. Like if you do these things, what's going to happen, as a result? And sometimes that's hard in the advocacy space. And so this notion that things might take a long time, that's why I think the Alliance for Justice sort of evaluation tools are so helpful, because you can kind of show progress and kind of show what you're doing or whatever. I also think now, so that's institutional donors. I think, sort of individual donors, I think Columbus is where it's at in terms of advocacy donors. I think there are much more sort of high wealth folks in Columbus that are investing in advocacy than maybe other parts of the state, and that's kind of a change. It used to all come from Cleveland. Now I think it comes from other parts of the state. So I think Cleveland is we step out in front of other funders, but and a lot of it will just depend on the issue too. There's been a lot of money going into criminal justice reform, so I mean there's activity in that space. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot around framing and branding that's important there, right? I mean, I saw this even during my time at the centers, to where there was a lot of effort to go for general operating support, because that was a way to get at supporting the work that we did in advocacy. But it all came off of the strength of the brand of the organization, the way we positioned the issues that we talked about, the services that we provided, the outcomes of those services, right? I mean, if you're demonstrating that you are an effective and strong organization, that can use general operating dollars well, it gives you the ability then to disperse that money in-house the way that it's most needed.
I'm going to say something that I'm sure it seems self-evident, but it's honestly, it happens all the time, and it's heartbreaking for us when we are approached by an organization that does incredibly good work, an incredibly powerful mission, but it's just sadly not an area where our particular foundation has ever been active. And so that initial homework of trying to understand what the foundation, and I hate the fact that old saying about if you know one foundation, you know one foundation is true, but understanding the parameters that a funder is trying to share through its guidelines or whatnot is so important. But having said that, I don't think that you only have to frame what you do in one way, and that's to Alicia's point. So you may find that a funder isn't an advocacy funder per se, but in case in point, cares passionately about racial justice issues. So would not necessarily have thought of itself as a funder around a mission of stopping the executions and the death penalty, but yet when you are able to share the science and the research and the data around the remarkably disproportionate impact the death penalty has on persons of color, it just, it starts to help them see your strategy, your mission, in a way that relates to the program areas that they're most connected to in perhaps a different way. So it's just, studying those guidelines.
Thank you all for your words of wisdom. I'm wondering, as nonprofit leadership and staff begin to think about engaging in advocacy, what are your suggestions as to how you might determine at what level advocacy begins to operate at the federal, state, or local level? And certainly some combination thereof, but in making those initial determinations, and again, certainly this may be context dependent, but it seems as if there's a whole world out there with so many interconnected levels of policy influence. Mm-hmm. How does one begin in understanding where they might have the most impact with limited staff and financial capacity?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And, particularly in the health and human services world, I have found through experiences that, follow the money. So where are the bulk of your dollars coming from? That quickly identifies for you the level of government where you're going to dedicate a lot of your resources around advocacy, right? So if it is largely, while there might be kind of the fall through from federal to state, who is really the program staff or the financial staff on the phone with the most? Is it the Department of Mental Health, or is it someone in a federal agency? Because if it's the Department of Mental Health, again, I think that starts to give some framing to where we focus a lot of our advocacy work at the state level. And again, I always frame it back to relationships. That really is the core. So when I was at the centers, because at least at that time we were 85% government funded, we couldn't afford not to have relationships with those folks that made those decisions on the policy or funding side, or for them not to know us. So when we thought about our work, it really was largely in that advocacy bucket. We needed to ensure that they knew our brand, what we did, the impacts of how we serve the community, and then how we could be a resource for them on the policy discussions around behavioral health or early childhood education, right? So there might have been some specific legislation that we got into, but the priority was ensuring that key influencers at the state level knew who we were, saw our services in action, so they were better informed about the policy decisions that they're making. So I think breaking it down that way with the focus on the area of government that is most impactful to the work that you're doing makes it a little bit easier to process than kind of looking at the whole ocean and then trying to figure out how to go from there.
I have a question. Lauren Welch. So one of the things that we talk about in advocacy is now we're in the digital age. And we were joking about Clee Twitter. I know I follow John. Kate Warren is very big on there as well. And so I found that as an ED of a nonprofit that I've gotten stories from that. I've been able to teach people about the work that I do. I've been able to educate people on why some of the issues that I advocate for are important. Can you speak a little bit about how the digital age has informed your advocacy and how it's helped you in that way?
That's just absolutely true. We have lots of examples. So there's two groups of people that I find that are like in the area, and they're all a little different. Facebook's different than Twitter. Twitter's different than LinkedIn. But like on Twitter, that's reporters and elected officials. They are all on Twitter. And we have generated stories. So a lot of times we'll see a story about a national topic that relates to something we've written about. We hop on that tweet. We tweet to that report, hey, we wrote this about that same topic. And that actually led last year to me doing a segment on Vice News about the sort of impact of Ohio's Medicaid waiver in terms of disproportionate impact on African Americans. And I didn't know what Vice News was at the time when they first reached out to me, so I'm not totally hip. But anyway, so it's good for that. And it's also a good way to get so like when we put stuff out or we put out new content every week, we ask our board members to retweet stuff for us, to post it on their Facebook pages. And we see that benefit, we see then the more people who use the information. And so I think that's true. And LinkedIn, I think, is really good too and what I like about all these platforms is that you can kind of see who's reading your stuff. And, in our email platform that we send out, we know if you click on it, we know who you are and that you opened it. And so I can see, which state agencies open stuff. When I see folks from the governor's office have opened something and there's like 55 opens after it, I know it got circulated, that it went around different places.
That is wonderful and petrifying.
The folks who've been most scared of my board members, I'm like, I know if you don't open our emails. But yeah, I think all that stuff is really important. And I think we had one of my colleagues, Adam White, wrote a tweet last year about the disproportionate impact around food stamps. On it went like that was our first viral tweet. He got 8,000 retweets, over 1 million impressions. It boosted our website traffic by 1/3, and it sort of dropped down a little bit, but it's still higher than it ever was. It brought a ton of new followers in. So, you can't just sort of deal with the traditional ways of sort of communicating with people. We have to use everything that's available to us.
I will say you should all sign up for John's weekly 5 things that you need to know this week. It's a really good snapshot, local, state, federal, all in one click, filled with infographics. So
we love infographics.
We do too. So
just a warning
sign up
point,
for
though,
that.
Lauren's question. So similar to, I think, just kind of core marketing and communications training, if that's a space that you dive into from an advocacy perspective, your staff need to be trained on how to do that effectively, because while one-on-one conversations and relationships could turn awry, the online world we know is not a forgiving place, and you don't want to damage the brand of your organization because you were not trained effectively. So just a side note to that discussion.
That's really a big side note.
Absolutely.
I'm David Crampton. I'm on the faculty here, and we like to draw maps. And every time we draw a map of Cleveland by some social problem, it always looks the same. And violence, poverty, it all traces back to housing patterns and a whole history I'm sure you know well. It becomes pretty daunting when every social problem we want to take on is tied to this long history of structural racism. And let me tell you, when you're teaching students, that's where they go. And then they say, we can't possibly fix this problem because it's rooted in this system of oppression. So how do we get past this notion that these little advocacy efforts that we're trying to do on the ground are just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? Or how would you tell students that you're right, a lot of this is pretty daunting that you want to take on, but we got to do it because people in Cleveland are suffering, and they're suffering, the lead poisoning, some of this stuff is just mind-boggling how wrong it is. And then it goes back to all of these powerful people who were never held accountable. So what's your response to the young, enthusiastic social work students like, I want to end child abuse, but one of the reasons I'm finding that really difficult is because child abuse is concentrated in neighborhoods that were destroyed by out-of-state banks.
Who wants that one?
So I'll start, but won't go long, so my colleagues can weigh in there. I completely understand and resonate with your question on multiple levels, right? As being an African-American woman in this work and in the environments that I'm in, and clearly understanding kind of the systemic issues that make us feel like despite our best efforts, we're still pushing a boulder uphill on some of the policy change that we're seeking. But if not us, then who, right? And I think that's kind of the guiding point. If we are not here doing this work on behalf of the organizations that are serving many clients, then who will be in this space? Because I think to Marsha's point, if we we do not get ourselves positioned in those rooms, then these conversations don't really happen in a meaningful way. And I think back to some of the earlier comments, like, yes, because this stuff is so deeply rooted, it feels impossible at times, and it takes a long path. But you have to keep at it, because sometimes it's those incremental wins that start to build towards something, even if it feels like it's not enough, even if it's not transformational in kind of a big dramatic way. It's the incremental work that still needs to happen regardless, because if we're not doing what we need to do from a kind of progressive or equity standpoint, you better believe there are a lot of folks on the other side that are still pushing for the things that they want. So I think there needs to be a counterbalance to that. Another point, which I think Marcia is well suited to talk about because of the work at the foundation, is that I'm a big believer in democracy building and ensuring that folks are registered to vote, that there is voter engagement, that there's citizen engagement on issues, because if we did see a glimmer of anything in this past election cycle, is that when we show up and show out at the polls the way that we need to, when we are training people to run for office that bring a different perspective and point of view to sit in those seats of power, we start to see change. And is it still hard and feel like we're not getting as far as we want to? Sure, but it's those incremental steps that go beyond just us as advocates professionally, but then also who's sitting where to decide what some of these things look like. So that's my 2 cents.
It's a great response. I mean, I think it has to be one of the hardest lessons to absorb, and I would say with young people, but it's really anybody who, look, if you're in this room, you probably wear your heart on the sleeve, right, for a lot of really tough social problems. And it is hard, I think, very hard to internalize, but also just really become mentally and emotionally comfortable with the fact that that most change is incremental, but that incremental change is not a failure and it's not settling. It is part of a path, and behind every incremental change is a face and a family and a child and a neighborhood and a community and a city and a state and a country and a world. So 2 examples. This guy did incredible work a number of years ago to get, through his work at the Metro Health System, about 10,000, 35,000, excuse me, I didn't read the last update. So qualified for Medicaid expansion before there was Medicaid expansion, right? So before there was this big national fight, the Supreme Court ruling, the whole thing. Metro Health led the way of showing the state that we could do this. We could start to expand Medicaid, and 35,000 people in Cleveland that didn't have health care Tuesday had it Wednesday. And you can't tell me that that is not an incredibly powerful moment in the life of 35,000 people times their families, their communities, their neighborhoods. Then they did incredible research and evaluation that showed it saved money, it had better health outcomes and all this. So lo and behold, what happens is you have Governor Kasich come along who reads this and says, well, this is a good idea at the state level. Flash forward, and now we've got 700,000 Ohioans that have benefited from the Medicaid expansion. And yes, that was incremental, and yes, even the 700,000 is incremental, but it is a sea change in the lives of those individual people. Same thing we're doing on the early childhood spectrum here in this community. Before there was Pre-for-CLE, before there was the county's Invest in Children universal pre-K program, we knew that the youngest children benefited exponentially by exposure and involvement to affordable, high-quality early learning, helped their path for the rest of their life. We knew that there were 12,000 children in the city of Cleveland that could benefit from that tomorrow if we had it. Are we there yet? No. But where we are now is about 4,500 of those 12,000 children now have a high-quality early learning experience in preschool that didn't 3 years ago, because the community came together, said this was a priority, and started to make incremental change. I know I'm going on and on, but the point is that there's no shame in incremental wins, and incremental wins are the inevitable backbone of systemic change. And so that's what we need to be in the business of doing and feeling good about it.
All right, who's got it?
I have it.
We have time for 2 more questions. So. Okay, well,
Hi, I'm Liz Harmath. And so many people post-November 2016 are now sort of newly interested in policy and advocacy. So how can nonprofits leverage that, whether it's training or something else, which seems scary because then they're not employees, they're not board members with whom you have a really close relationship, and so you lose some control over them and what that message actually turns into. But how can you leverage it in a positive, proactive way?
I mean, I guess I guess where I would start is first I'd sort of identify those people. So ask them, what are you interested in being an advocate, for whatever the organization is? And so I'd identify them first. I'd survey them about who their relationships are with, who do they know? Because I think that's one of the things we're surprised by sometimes is, oh, you actually know this person who's in charge of this. That's really helpful to know. So I think ask them what they know and where their relations. And this is all easy to do now. I mean, this is all stuff you can do through email and through stuff like SurveyMonkey and all that kind of stuff. There are a lot of tools out there that you can use. You can never, I'm not even sure I can control what my own staff say, let alone what my volunteers or my donors say. But I guess you can offer people information. There's lots of great ways to do this. Like one of the things you could do is just offer, like if you had, let's say you have 500 people on your list or 100 people on your list who are interested in this, like offer a conference call once a quarter where you give them an update. Here's what we're doing. Here's the bills. This is the issues where we need help. We're going to send you out an email. We're going to send you to a site where you just enter your information in. It generates a letter. You can take people up this ladder, send a letter, make a phone call, make a visit, testify. You can sort of take people along a path. But I think you first got to just ask people, if they're identify the people who are interested, identify where the relationships are, identify the issues they're interested in, offer them information, offer them training. Those are all relatively simple things to do. And like I said earlier, if you want to start small, start small. You don't have to do all of this at once. You can sort of figure out what you can sort of sustain.
You could also, you got to embrace the mess, right? Because there's no public policy process that hasn't been messy, I would guess. But at the same time, I think it's really important to understand that in the world of advocacy, you can course correct all the time. Yeah. Like you don't just have to, right, you don't just can't, it's not that you can, it's that you have to, as John rightly notes. So I hope that helps ease fear a little bit in thinking that, by God, we've got one strategy and we've got to go full tilt and everybody's got to be saying the exact same thing. Of course you want coordination. Of course you want appropriate branding and marketing and cohesion of message. But it's absolutely okay if there gets to be a little bit of messiness involved, because then you just step back, reevaluate, course correct, and start to move again. And we actually, I will tell you, as a funder of advocacy work, look for that type of nimbleness, if nimbleness is a word, and also invest in helping you build that kind of nimbleness that allows you to course correct when the landscape inevitably shifts, as it certainly will.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I work with youth and health advocacy through film. First, I wanted to just add a comment to the professor ahead of me. Excuse me, sir. I'm sorry. Yeah, David? Yeah, so I know you made a point about the young people and what they're experiencing, and a lot of the other college students want to help them. One thing that I've noticed is a mentor. If there's at least one caring adult in a young person's life that could help them change what their future might be. One thing, that's just one example that might help, because what I've noticed in a lot of the Cleveland public schools, and actually a lot of the students I work with in many other different areas, are young people. Some young people feel as though they're not worth it. They're not worth anything, and they have everything around them in the community or in the media or whatever it might be that's supporting that lie to that individual. So that sense of self-worth is deplenishing, unfortunately. But a mentor, support, advocacy could help show them their worth, that they can change what their tomorrow might become. And one thing that I've seen alongside that is that connection, that relationship is so empowering, and it gives hope. It's a sense of enlightenment. And that piece of enlightenment is what I've learned over the years. And what I want to know is, with the advocacy groups, are there great examples that you have identified, or just anywhere, no matter if it's local or globally, advocacy groups who are doing great work, but they're sharing that information with young people so they can give them that enlightenment that you can change your tomorrow? I feel as though I found out too late in my life about what advocacy really means. I wish I knew when I was 10, honestly. I mean, that would have been amazing. So are there examples of organizations who are sharing this work, which is in turn giving life to our young people, which will be our advocates for tomorrow, who will help continue to push these agendas forward? So that was my question that I had for all of you.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a piece of that, and I actually was very happy when my organization started doing this a couple years ago, is that you can't overlook the power of internship opportunities for young people, like not just college students, but even starting at the high school level and what that looks like, especially when it's an opportunity to introduce them to worlds or careers or pathways that they probably didn't even know existed, right? So I'm from Cleveland. I grew up in Glenville. I had no idea what a lobbyist was or what the government did beyond maybe kind of the John Glenn Health Center that was across the street from where I lived, and knew it did something over there. But beyond that, had no real understanding. And it wasn't until really getting through college that I had an introduction to understand what that world looked like. But GCP a couple years ago started a specific rotational internship for students in the Cleveland Public Schools to introduce them to the world of chambers and what they do. So during the summer, every few weeks, we have a student from one of the high schools that is with us and have made trips to Columbus with us as staff, or has gone to City Hall with us to start to get a feel of what is this world, what does this mean? And for a couple of those students that have stayed in touch with us, it's really helped to start to influence how they're thinking about what they're going to major in college, and the type of careers that they're thinking about that they didn't even think they could be exposed to before that moment. So I think whether it is in the kind of health and human services world or community development or job training, if you are thoughtful about kind of that connecting piece, so how do we connect with schools? How do we connect with youth-serving organizations to bring students in a structured way to give them exposure to this work? While it is a micro step, it is, I think, an important and life-changing step to kind of get at a portion of what you're saying, especially if that organization has a focus on advocacy and wants to engage young people that way.
I was going to add, too, we had a program that we operated for several years with a national group called Advocates for Youth that focuses around issues around reproductive health. And so it involved training, working with high school students and college students who did advocacy around reproductive health. And so we took them to Columbus, we take them to D.C. And I think the last group that we had actually worked to with local school districts here in Cuyahoga County to get them to adopt better policies around reproductive health education. So we've done that. I think that's important. I think, and what Alicia said about internships is, we also support that. We have, graduate students and stuff who work with us, and we hire them a lot of times. So yeah, we do a lot of different things like that. I think you're right. I think that's important.
Okay, I need to advocate for the remainder of our panel's evening by making this our last question.
Okay.
My name is Nathan. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I've helped start 3 nonprofits that have been with all the founders have been like young, everyday people, and some have been more successful than others. But my question to you is, because we don't get a lot of, the hardest thing with being a young person trying to make a change is funding, because it's kind of like when you're applying for a job and they need 3 to 5 years experience. So my question, I guess, is because I'm also interested in how people advocacy holding government accountable. I'm wondering if you guys have stories of people holding foundations accountable through something that looks like advocacy, because it can be really hard to communicate. A lot of times it feels like they're funding successful poor people instead of funding poor people to be successful, and that can be really challenging, especially as a young person.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if you've ever had any reason to be familiar with a national organization called the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, but its whole reason for being is to do what you just identified as a real need, and that is holding feet to the fire of a sector that really has a lot of flexibility and not necessarily a lot of transparency. And so NCRP is, I think, a tremendous resource to help build campaigns, to help reach out. It's got great research. So I encourage you to take a look at that because it really is, it comes from a philosophy that is very community-based, grassroots-based, respect for community-based leadership, young leadership, progressive leadership. So I hope that that would be a really good resource for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
All right, I think that brings us to our conclusion. I want to thank our panel. Would you please thank them as well?
Thanks for staying.
This has really been a tremendous opportunity to hear a lot of great reflections on how we all can use advocacy tools in our work and maybe leverage our organizations to do more. You're looking at a guy who started the evening thinking Boulder advocacy was in Boulder, Colorado. Now I know it's being Boulder in our advocacy. So I've come a long way. Thank you all for coming tonight. We'll see you next month for our session on strategic branding. Have a good night.